I'm very pleased to be here to talk on this very important subject for swine producers in Iowa. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the 3 foreign animal diseases that are of biggest concern. They're foreign because we don't have them in the U.S., and if we do get them, they'll have major impacts on trade, and it'll trigger an emergency response by state and federal officials and the industry to attempt to control and eradicate it. I'll also mention the secure pork supply plans, which we've been working on for a number of years with the industry and state and federal officials on how to deal with and minimize as much as possible the consequences and trying to keep producers and the swine industry in business during this outbreak. This presentation was prepared with the help of Dr. Pam Zabel, who is a veterinarian who also works in the center at Iowa State. So the 3 diseases that we're most concerned about are foot and mouth disease, and that affects all cloven-hoofed animals. That includes cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, deer, other wild ruminants. Classical swine fever, also known as hog cholera, which we eradicated in the 1970s, and that only affects pigs, and African swine fever, which has never been in this country, and that also only affects pigs. Any of these will shut down our exports pretty dramatically, but they're not public health or food safety concerns. We need to always be reassuring the public if we get one of these diseases, the food, the meat and milk are safe. These are not public health problems. They're very bad animal health problems. So FMD is the most contagious disease of animals. It's highly contagious within a herd and between herds. It's a major animal disease preventing world trade of animals and animal products. Countries that have foot and mouth disease can't sell live animals or fresh meat to other countries because other countries don't want to bring in the virus. The mortality is low in adult cattle and swine. Most of them will recover and survive. They'll be pretty sick for 2 or 3 weeks, but most will recover. We associate high mortality with foot and mouth disease because the initial response is always stamping out to kill everything in the infected herd and surrounding herds. Young animals can have high mortality. So you can have 50%, 80, 90% mortality in baby pigs and baby calves with some strains of the virus. However, even though they recover, it is a very serious disease and very painful for these animals. It causes blisters in the mouth, on the feet, and on the teats. They don't want to eat, they don't want to drink, they don't want to stand up. And it takes a couple of weeks to recover if they're allowed to recover. So there's a lot of loss of condition. Some of them never fully return to productivity like before they were infected. And FMD is endemic in 96 countries in the world. More countries have foot and mouth disease than don't have foot and mouth disease. And you can see in this map, the countries in green are free of foot and mouth disease. The ones in light green are free with vaccination. So in other words, they vaccinate, but they don't have any evidence of disease. If they're worried about quitting vaccinating because the disease might come back, especially from neighboring countries. So more countries have it than don't have it, so we're always under threat of this virus coming in from other countries. And the U.S. has had 9 outbreaks of foot and mouth disease between 1870 and 1929. So in a 60-year period, we had 9 outbreaks due to importation of live animals or animal products. Then the U.S. government put safeguards in place regarding importation of animals and animal products. And now for 89 years, we haven't had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. We've been very good and very lucky at keeping it out. But there's increasing pressure all the time with more and more international travel, more and more international trade. We hadn't had highly pathogenic avian influenza until 2015 when we had the really big outbreak, especially in Iowa. We hadn't had porcine epidemic diarrhea virus before. So we're in an age or an era where it seems that these viruses are transmitting from country to country more readily. All of these outbreaks were controlled by stop movement and stamping out. So when they observed the disease, and the symptoms were pretty dramatic, so even 90 years ago, it was hard to miss the disease in cattle and swine. So it was diagnosed clinically. They stopped all animal movement in an area around the infected farms, killed everything on the farm and neighboring farms, and were able to stamp it out. However, we're really concerned that we may not be able to control it with stop movement and stamping out. The herds are very large now. The reason you stamp out or kill everything in the herd is to stop the spread of the virus. So you want to do it within 24 hours if possible, or 48 hours. If it takes you several days to kill all the animals, they'll stop shedding on their own, so you might as well let them recover. So when you have herds of, feedlots with 50,000 head of cattle, dairies with 5,000 dairy cows, sow farms with 20,000 sows, you just can't kill them quickly enough. And if you did, you couldn't get rid of the carcasses. So there's a lot of concern about, would we be able to stamp it out? And these very large herds tend to be located in the same region close to each other. So then it's more easily spread from herd to herd. And we have very extensive movement of animals that can move the disease before we even know we have it. All of these viruses are shed by an infected animal before they look sick. So it's likely that we will be moving infected animals before we know they're infected, and that can spread the disease. We also have very large feral swine and deer populations now that can carry the disease from one herd to another if they move between herds. So we need to be prepared to respond in new ways. Until about 15 or 20 years ago, the plan was stop movement and stamping out. But because of changes in the agriculture industry, the plan is adapting to the new reality of animal agriculture in the U.S. Dr. Rodemaker already mentioned that there's about 1 million pigs on the road every day, every weekday. And again, these can be infected before they look sick. So the chances that we move pigs before we know they have the disease can be fairly high. And there's a lot of cattle on the road every day. And then there are fairs and exhibitions where animals come together. So there's a lot of opportunity for disease spread. And in our modern animal agriculture, these animals move a long ways, especially pigs. This shows in shipments of hogs in U.S. states, in other words, pigs crossing state lines. And in the 80s and 90s, there was very little of that. Most of the pigs were born, raised, and slaughtered in the same state. And since then, there's been a dramatic increase in pigs being born in one state, trucked to another state for finishing and or slaughter. And most of those come to Iowa. You can see that in 2011, the last year I have statistics, about 40 million pigs crossed state lines in 2011. 22.5 million of those came into Iowa for finishing because we have the grain and we have the slaughter capacity. So there's a lot of pressure with all of those pigs coming in, especially to Iowa, that they could bring disease with them before we even know they have it. And we have great diversity in the hog operations in the U.S. In Iowa, I always tend to think of the really large operations. And 62% of the inventory of pigs in the U.S. are on farms with more than 5,000 pigs. And that's 3,300 farms. However, there's almost 49,000 farms that have less than 100 pigs. And the state and federal officials have to deal with this disease on all of the farms, big and small. So it's a huge task when one of these diseases comes in to monitor what's going on all the really big farms and the really small farms and everything in between. So when we started developing the secure food supply plans in 2009, actually, the groups, state, federal, industry, and academics would discuss how do we respond. And there were those that said we have to keep killing them until the disease is gone. And those that said in a really big outbreak we won't be able to. Even if we wanted to, we can't kill them fast enough. We just can't do it, or we couldn't get rid of the carcasses. So we came up with what we call the phases and types of foot and mouth disease outbreak. You always want to start with stamping out. When you find that first case, you want to stamp it out because maybe that's the only case. So a type 1 is a focal outbreak. As far as you know, it's just in a small area, and the state and federal officials would work as fast as they can, stop movement in that area, and kill all the infected herds, hopefully stamping it out. If it has spread to a moderate regional outbreak, they would probably continue stamping out. There'd be a larger area, a lot more herds to stamp out, more area that's under controlled movement. If it is a large regional outbreak, it may be that the responsible officials will decide to stop stamping out because it just can't work. So then we let herds recover, and we face the fact that this is going to go on for quite some time. If we can't stop it at a type 3 and it becomes a widespread or national outbreak or a catastrophic U.S. outbreak, that's where FMD has spread essentially throughout the U.S. At that point, probably give up on the emergency response and plan a long-term multi-year eradication program. So we would have this disease for many years. In a type 1 or 2, we would count on vaccine to help slow it down. Doing ring vaccination, vaccinate all the animals around the infected premises to try and slow or stop the virus. However, if we can't stop it with vaccination, stop movement and stamping out, and it gets to a type 3, it will be very hard to stop it from moving on up. But the state and federal officials will try their best, working with industry, to do that. And the vaccine is a big problem. Foot and mouth disease is the most difficult disease to vaccinate that we have in animals. And that's because it's not just one virus. There's 7 different serotypes and about 65 subtypes. And to cover all those potential viruses that are out there in the world, you need to have 23 different vaccines to cover those 65 viruses. And you don't know which one you're going to get. So you need to stockpile, to be fully prepared, stockpile 23 vaccines for 23 viruses for all the cattle and pigs you're going to want to vaccinate. And that's very expensive to do. So we essentially do not have vaccine, foot and mouth vaccine, to stop the outbreak now. The North American Vaccine Bank has about 2.5 million doses of foot and mouth disease vaccine for 10 different strains. Iowa alone would need closer to 25 million doses immediately, and then you need a booster dose after 3 weeks, so about 50 million doses. So there isn't nearly enough vaccine in the stockpile. And the industry has come to recognize that. And the Animal Ag Coalition, which is all the ag groups, commodity groups, are going to Congress and requesting money in the next farm bill to build up a foot and mouth disease vaccine stockpile. They've requested $150 million a year for 5 years in the next farm bill to establish the stockpile, and it would take probably 4 or 5 years to get that stockpile fully built. They're also asking for $30 million to enhance the National Laboratory Animal Network, which includes the Iowa State University Diagnostic Lab. So it's the state diagnostic labs. Those labs are essential in detecting the virus and controlling it. And in an outbreak like high-path avian influenza, our diagnostic lab was working 7 days a week around the clock trying to do all the diagnostics for avian influenza, and they did a great job. But foot and mouth disease would be much bigger. We need a bigger investment in these diagnostic labs to be ready. And in fact, in Iowa, Iowa State University is asking the state legislature for $100 million to build a new expanded diagnostic lab to handle current needs and potential future needs of an outbreak. And the states don't have enough money in their state departments of agriculture to manage an outbreak like this. So in the Farm Bill, they're asking for $70 million that would go to USDA, and USDA would distribute that to the states to help the states be better prepared. So we're waiting to see if this actually gets put in the Farm Bill. If any of you have a chance to talk to your legislators at the national level, you might mention how important this is for the animal agriculture industry. So, and one of the reasons these three diseases are so important is that they are regulated, they have a major impact on international trade because of the World Organization for Animal Health, which is the OIE, World Organization for Animal Health, and they set the rules for the World Trade Organization on trade of animals and animal products. And any one of these three would essentially shut down our exports. It's not like PEDV, which didn't shut down exports because it's not one of the listed diseases. These three diseases are listed. And we won't import products from any country that has these diseases, and other countries wouldn't import from us if we had it. So for FMD, that's stopping exports from the U.S. of all cloven-hoofed animals and their uncooked products, fresh product. And for CSF and ASF, it would just affect swine and pork. The exports would be lost. And then also on day one, control areas will be established around the infected premises. Control areas, a minimum of 6 miles around each infected premises, but it might be a whole county or a whole state at the beginning. And in those control areas, there would be a stop movement, and you need a permit to move animals out of the control area. And prices will drop because we're losing our exports, and we have to convince the U.S. consumers it's still okay to eat the meat and drink the milk. This shows the percent of federally inspected beef and pork that are exported from the U.S. from 1988 to 2016. In 1988, if we lost our exports, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But now it's a really big deal. The industry has been very, very successful in increasing exports of beef and pork, and that contributes a great deal to the value of the animals. In 2016, we exported about 26% of the pork. It added about $54 per head of pig. Exported about 14% of the beef. It added $270 to the value of an animal. And you can see in 2003, in the red line where it drops down to 0 in 2003, that's where we had 1 case of mad cow disease. And all of our partners quit taking our beef. And it took several years to get those exports back, even though it was only 1 case that was taken care of right away. So the effect on exports would be one of the biggest problems we have. And there's really not much we can do about that. On day one, our exports will be lost, and the question is, how long will they be lost? And Dr. Dermot Hayes at Iowa State in 2011 did a study for the pork industry on the impact of the foot and mouth disease outbreak. And he estimated that if we got it, we would have it for at least 10 years, because if it got out of control, it might take that long to get rid of it. And over that 10-year period, the farm economy would lose about $200 billion. And not just in beef and pork, they would have a major hit, but also in corn and soybeans, because we would be feeding fewer animals. So the corn and soybean prices would drop. Poultry would drop because beef and pork would be cheaper. So it would have a major impact throughout the ag economy, not just on beef and pork. And Iowa has more at risk than any other state. We're the most livestock dense state, with about 24 million animals that are susceptible to foot and mouth disease. We're #1 in corn and often #1 in soybean production. A lot of Iowans are employed in the processing industries, and our tax revenues depend on agriculture. So the economic hit for Iowa would be pretty serious. The USDA does have response plans for foot and mouth disease. There's and for classical swine fever and African swine fever. So the USDA has plans on how to respond to these that depend on how big the outbreak is. There's a lot of information in these plans, but the USDA has developed and updated these plans. So the tools for controlling any one of these foreign animal diseases would be stop movement, Don't move any animals or anything else that doesn't have to be moved so that you're not moving the virus in an area around the infected premises. Biosecurity is essential. That's the number one thing producers can do to protect their animals is biosecurity, and we'll look at that. And then stamping out, depopulating all the animals on the infected premises and neighboring premises because the neighbors might have it also. Trace back and trace forward. Trace back is where did all the animals come from on that premises in the last 28 days. Trace forward is animals that left that premises in the last 28 days, where did they go? Because that's where you find out how the virus got there and where it may have gone to. Rapid diagnostics, we need to have that so we know where the virus is, and then vaccination. If you look at this list of tools, it's going to be very hard to use any of these tools. Stop movement, you can't stop it until you find it, and by then you might have already moved it. In the swine industry, it's very hard to stop movement. Biosecurity needs to be in place before the outbreak. Stamping out, we may be overwhelmed. We don't have good traceability, especially in the cattle industry. We're in better shape with rapid diagnostics than we were. Our diagnostic labs are better prepared. And as I mentioned, we don't have enough vaccine. So for foot and mouth disease and classical swine fever, there are vaccines around the world. We just don't have them in enough numbers in the U.S. African swine fever, there's no vaccine anywhere in the world. So we'll never be able to use vaccine for African swine fever. So for foot and mouth disease and classical swine fever, if they get out of control, we can stop killing and have a long-term eradication program based on vaccination, like we did with pseudorabies and hog cholera before. African swine fever, there's no vaccine and not really any hope of a vaccine. So African swine fever, we just have to keep killing them till it's gone. That's really our only choice with African swine fever. But at the beginning of an outbreak, we won't have enough vaccine to really help us until the vaccine stockpile is built up. So the USDA started funding our center at Iowa State to begin working with the industry, state and federal officials to develop secure food supply plans. And for pork, it's for all three diseases, focusing on moving animals from premises that have no evidence of infection, doing everything they can to prove they're not likely to be infected, and they can send their animals to slaughter or to the next stage of production. So this shows one way to do control areas, and this kind of looks like what we saw with high-path avian influenza in northwest Iowa. Each infected farm, there's a minimum of 6-mile radius around it that you can't move anything in that area without a permit from the state or federal authorities. And 6-mile radius is 120 square miles, and in Iowa that can include an awful lot of animals. And it may well be that the control area will initially be a whole county or maybe the whole state. So you need permits to move. So you want to be able to demonstrate that you're not likely to get infected because you have really good biosecurity, and do surveillance so that to show that there's no evidence of infection, and then request a permit to move when you're in the control area. If you're not in the control area, you can still move. So the goal of the Secure Pork Supply Plan is to provide a workable business continuity plan for pork premises with no evidence of foreign animal disease infection and the associated industries, packing, processing, trucking, that's credible to the responsible regulatory authorities, because the state and federal authorities' responsibility is to stop this disease, stop this virus. But they want to allow as much business continuity as they can while trying to stop the virus. Participation ahead of the outbreak is voluntary. If producers decide to participate in the Secure Pork Supply Plan ahead of the outbreak, they'll be better prepared, but that's voluntary. So the common components of the Secure Food Supply Plans, all of them, including pork, voluntary pre-outbreak preparedness. What can you do to prepare your farm ahead of the outbreak? Biosecurity is the number one thing that's needed, is increased biosecurity. Be ready to do surveillance, to collect oral fluids or other samples to submit for surveillance to show that you don't there's no evidence of infection. There'll be epidemiology questionnaires about what came onto your farm, where have animals gone from your farm that might have brought the disease in. There'll be guidance on what you have to do to be able to get a movement permit, and you'll have to request the permits. And these are based on risk assessments, some of them completed, some still in process. So on day one of an outbreak, when you hear there's an outbreak, you'll hear that there is a stop movement around the outbreak. And again, we don't know how big of an area that will be. It depends on what's going on at the time. Animals that are already in trucks need to land somewhere. So you've got animals in trucks and you find out, whoops, there shouldn't be any animals on the road. So those animals have to go somewhere. They may be allowed to continue to their destination. They might be returned to the site of origin, or they might be handled somewhere in between, unloaded and dealt with, either euthanized or monitored. And producers may need to be prepared to manage their animals without moving animals for several days to weeks. So, and that's pretty hard in the swine industry. It may be that, okay, it's too dangerous to move animals. You need to be weaning and emptying out your farrowing facility for the next sows, but you can't move them. So producers need to think about that. What would you do if you had a stop movement for 3 or 4 weeks before things open up again? How would you handle that? Movement permits will be required most likely for all movements onto and off of premises during the outbreak. And you need to have a PIN, a premises identification number. That's the first thing. If you don't have that, you have to get a PIN before anything can happen. So everybody should get their PIN number from their state veterinarian's office ahead of the outbreak. And biosecurity is the most important thing you can do. And the thing we've learned from PED and high-path AI is that the normal level of biosecurity isn't adequate for one of these highly contagious foreign animal diseases. And biosecurity is expensive and it's inconvenient. There's no way around that. So producers implement the level of biosecurity they need to protect from endemic diseases so they can stay in business. However, endemic diseases, those we are used to, there is herd immunity from vaccination or previous exposure to most of those diseases. So if the disease is introduced, there's very low level of shedding of organisms and a high level of resistance, so the disease doesn't spread very much. For these foreign animal diseases, there's no herd immunity. So there's high levels of pathogen shedding, and it only takes a little bit of pathogen to infect the animals. So you need much greater biosecurity for a foreign animal disease than you do for endemic diseases. So part of the Secure Pork Supply Plan is working again with federal, state officials and industry. We've come up with the biosecurity self-assessment checklist. Everything that might introduce the virus onto your farm, and a checklist, are you taking care of every one of those things? And again, this is voluntary. And to help you meet that checklist, one of the things that's recommended is a biosecurity coordinator for every premises, every farm. And that coordinator can use this manual, and it gives a lot of advice on how to meet each of the items in the checklist. For swine raised indoors, outdoors is a lot harder. We still need to work on that. The best thing to do is, if we have one of these outbreaks, move all the pigs indoors so you can protect them better. So all of this information is available on the website, this website, securepork.org. And we've been working on this plan since 2010, and it's essentially fully developed, as far as we can get it, given the limitations on surveillance and other factors and availability of vaccines. So you can go to this website. We've just newly produced it. There's a tab at the top, one that says Producers, and that's producers. Click on that, and it gives a lot of advice on what producers can do to prepare. There's a tab for veterinarians that tells veterinarians what they can do to help their producers prepare. A tab for packers, because packers will be heavily impacted by this. So what do packers need to do, especially around biosecurity? And a tab for the regulatory officials. And then teaching material, training materials you can use with your employees for training. This is the team at the Center for Food Security and Public Health at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State. Do we have, Chris, do we have a few minutes for questions, or should we go on to Dr. LaBounty? We have till 10:30? Okay. Are there any questions? Concerns? I know there are concerns.
I got a question for you, Jim. There's a lot of, we have Seneca Valley virus, right? We're seeing more and more cases of those around here, and it doesn't appear to really be a disease of economic significance or consequence. So what would you tell producers about what they should think about if they would happen to see vesicles on their farm? Can they distinguish Seneca virus from FAD or any of the other vesicular diseases if they saw a vesicle on a pig's snout in their finisher tomorrow?
Okay, so the question was about Seneca Valley virus, which we're seeing a lot more of than we used to. And Seneca Valley virus does not shut off exports. It's not one of the listed diseases for OIE. It doesn't have a big impact on production, but it causes blisters that look exactly like foot and mouth disease. You can't tell the difference by looking at a pig whether it's Seneca Valley virus or foot and mouth disease. And the more Seneca Valley we have, the greater the concern that producers might overlook vesicles due to foot and mouth disease and just assume it's Seneca Valley. So that increases our problem of catching it early. So if you see vesicles, blisters on the toes, in your pigs anywhere, you should call your veterinarian, have samples taken, because the veterinarian can't tell by looking either. The only way to distinguish is send samples to the diagnostic lab to make sure that it's Seneca Valley and not foot and mouth disease. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
In the event that there was a stop movement, would that also stop all movement of manure?
So if there's a stop movement, would that stop movement of manure? There, you would need a permit for movement of manure. The next speaker, Dr. LaBounty, is with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and we'll talk about how Iowa would work with, respond to this disease. Yes.
We have a vaccine that we can differentiate foot-and-mouth disease from live virus, or where we at in that process?
So the question is about marker vaccines for foot and mouth disease. There is a marker. Any vaccine we use would be a marker vaccine. Like the, pseudorabies we eradicated because we had a marker vaccine. Of course, right now we don't have enough of any vaccine. But if the stockpile is built up, that would be with marker vaccines. And that's important because a herd can be vaccinated and they don't get sick, but they can still carry the virus, just like we saw with pseudorabies. Now, pigs don't become long-term carriers like they do with pseudorabies, but cattle can be long-term carriers of foot and mouth disease. Classical swine fever, the stockpile has about 1 million doses of classical swine fever vaccine, and it's the old vaccine, the same one we used before, not a marker vaccine. There is a new marker vaccine that's been licensed, and hopefully in the future there'll be funding to stockpile a marker vaccine for classical swine fever also. That means in an outbreak with a marker vaccine, you've got to do a huge amount of serologic testing to prove that a herd is not carrying the virus, they're not been infected. And our diagnostic lab will have to do all of that.
That's the reason, please contact your senators in Congress for a new one, because I don't think we've got the capacity to be able to handle that today. And, we're in Iowa, right? Probably the biggest agriculture state in the U.S., so Iowa State University will be looked upon to be leading that charge, and we need to have those resources available. And I always tell people, it's like, well, how real is the threat? It's like, well, we introduced PED 3-4 years ago, and we're still not sure how that is, which means there's still a hole in the dike for any of these other foreign animal diseases to come on over. So it's a big deal.
Yes. Other questions? All right, let's...
Please help me thank Dr. Roth for his presentation. Our next presenter this morning is Dr. Judith LaBounty. Dr. LaBounty graduated from Oklahoma State Center of Veterinary Health Sciences in 2014. Her previous experience included working as a veterinarian for a turkey breeding company here in Iowa, as well as working for a small animal emergency clinic veterinarian. She is currently employed as the Emergency Management Veterinarian for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. Please help me welcome Dr. LaBounty.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the plans that the state of Iowa has put together to help guide Iowa's pork producers and what they should expect if we were to have foot and mouth in the U.S. or in Iowa, and what they can do to be ready so that we can respond more quickly to an outbreak. So we've got 6 big steps when we have the initial case of foot and mouth. And number 1, livestock with suspicious clinical signs. So like Dr. Roth just said, we can't distinguish foot and mouth from other very serious diseases. And so everyone needs to be very vigilant about the clinical signs in their herd. Second is getting issued a quarantine from the state. Third is doing an epi investigation. Fourth is indemnity. Fifth, depop. And sixth, disposal. And we're going to go through each one. So if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, you need to know these phone numbers. These are who a producer needs to call if they have animals with vesicles. They can talk to their local veterinarian, the veterinarian they see normally. They can call us at Department of Agriculture, or they can call USDA APHIS VS. And any of those veterinarians will be able to respond to that level of an emergency. So IDALS sends a foreign animal disease diagnostician or another vet to the premise to examine the herd or flock and collect samples, because at this point we might not know if it's foot and mouth, if it's Seneca, if it's vesicular stomatitis. At this time, they will be issued a verbal stop movement order, and that prevents everything. So like we said with the manure, it's going to prevent animals, livestock products, and livestock byproducts from moving in and out of the premises until we have a definitive diagnosis. IDALS has the power to issue quarantines, and so a quarantine will be based on lab results or clinical signs that indicate foot and mouth. But if a farm falls into a control area, they could be issued a quarantine as well. And like we've said, it prevents anything from leaving the farm: livestock products, and byproducts. And so that's something that a producer really needs to be prepared for in advance. A quarantine comes with 3 attachments. One is the boundary map, which is what we're showing here, and it's going to outline the perimeter of the premises, and it's going to show the decontamination area. Ideally, there'll be one area where you can enter and exit the farm by going through a decontamination process. The second attachment is procedures for maintaining the quarantine boundary. This is the security measures essentially you need to take around a farm. So limiting and access with visitors, only having one entrance and exit, having secure fencing around the farm. And then the third attachment is cleaning and disinfection at the decontamination area. And so the state provides guidance on the minimum biosecurity or decontamination measures that need to be carried out at that area to allow response personnel in and out of the farm. Then we have to do an epi investigation because we need to know what has come on and off the farm in the past 4 weeks. And for a producer, having well-maintained records makes the epi investigation easier for everyone involved. Records that you're going to need are record of any movement of animals, products, byproducts, feed, litter, bedding, manure, and carcasses on and off the premise in the past 4 weeks. Visitor log is really essential to track any service personnel, construction or maintenance, veterinarians, consultants, or any friends or neighbors that have come over and had contact with the pigs. This helps us determine other herds that are in danger, with perhaps the service personnel moving around and seeing their farms on their route, or identifying anybody that's had foreign travel. And finally, mortality records are important, so we know if there was any indication in changes of level of mortality, but it also helps with our indemnity process. So appraisal and indemnity are very complex issues, and we won't get into all of the ins and outs of how much a head is worth or anything like that. But the most important part to understand is that indemnity paperwork has to be signed before we can depop a farm. And so having that paperwork read and understood ahead of time really helps speed that process along, because indemnity needs to be signed as quickly as possible so we can start stamping out on a farm. The other step that a producer can take is to pre-register with the federal programs, System Award Management and Dun & Bradstreet, which is how the federal government pays the indemnity out to the producer. And registration is free, and the USDA provides information on how to register for that, and it's all based on poultry, but all the steps are the same. So mass depopulation, stamping out. The state veterinarian of Iowa has the authority to order mass depopulation to control disease. And if FMD is confirmed in Iowa, like Dr. Roth said, stamping out is going to have to be our first line of defense, especially if Iowa is the state of the index case. Depop and carcass disposal is our most probable method of eradication to start with. Livestock on the infected premise, so the initial premise, will be depopulated as soon as possible. And it's possible that susceptible livestock on contact premises may also be subject to depopulation. And a producer needs to think of ahead of time, and do they have the equipment for euthanasia? So a captive bolt or another system that you can use to depopulate the animals on the farm. And how will the carcasses be moved? If you have sows in gestation crates, are they going to be moved out of the gestation crate prior to euthanasia, or how are you going to get a carcass out of a gestation crate or the building? And those are really big questions that need to be answered by that producer. And like it's already been discussed, if the outbreak progresses, the USDA may have to modify our response plans to include vaccination and quarantine until recovery. So carcass disposal, this is where IDOLs will work with the Department of Natural Resources to handle how we're going to dispose of carcasses in any product or byproduct on the farm. Our top choices are on-farm disposal in the form of composting or burial. So the landowner needs to know, does the property have adequate land for a burial? Is composting going to be done? Is composting being done inside? And what is the carbon source for that compost? Only in rare cases are we going to allow products and livestock to be moved off-site for disposal. This was done in HPAI, and it is absolutely not the preferred route of disposing of carcasses. So continuity of business involves two big steps. One is our stop movement order, and second is permitting. So Iowa has developed a timeline for stop movement orders that we are hoping to be able to follow during foot and mouth. So first is, if another state has foot and mouth, we might have to place a stop movement order on susceptible livestock into Iowa. And this could be as long as 30 days for livestock and as long as 7 days for their products. As we know, Iowa has strong agricultural ties with other states. And depending on the state that's affected would have a strong impact on our stop movement order. So if we have the FMD in our state, we may issue a stop movement order on susceptible livestock moving within Iowa. And all movement is restricted within a control area at all times, and the release of a stop movement order does not necessarily apply to a control area farm. So like we said earlier, this can have a significant impact on continuity of business and create significant animal welfare issues when you can't move animals off a farm in their normal production schedule. So an individual producer and the production system that they're a part of need to have a protocol in place for addressing interruptions to normal production timelines. And so this is our model for releasing a stop movement order in Iowa, but again, this does not apply to anything in a control area. So within 6 hours of announcing foot and mouth in the U.S. or Iowa, trucks carrying susceptible livestock need to be off the Iowa roads. Trucks in transit will be allowed to continue to their final destination, but no new movements will be allowed within the first 24 hours. And this allows us time for an epi investigation and to get a handle on the scope of the outbreak. In any release of stop movement orders or permitting, we want to approve low-risk movements as soon as possible. But when we're ready, IDALs will lift the stop movement order on animals going to livestock, or livestock going to slaughter, or products coming off of a farm that is not linked to an infected premise and is not showing clinical signs, and this will most likely involve a permit. The next release would be on intrastate movement of livestock, again, as long as they aren't linked to the infected premise and they don't have any clinical signs. Then, when we're ready again, the interstate movement order will be lifted. Again, if they don't have any epi links to an infected premise and they're not showing any clinical signs, and an import permit may be required even if it's not currently required now. And permitting. So this is a very, very major step of trying to continue business as normal during an outbreak. We need to allow movement to keep business moving, but we need to decrease our risk of disease transmission as much as possible. So when a permit is requested, they need to do it as soon as possible and at least 24 to 48 hours prior to movement, because it does take discussion between incident command, the other state, and various other groups to come to a consensus on permitting. So delays to permits can occur. And the secure pork supply plan might be used to permit movement of non-infected premises in a control area, but we might not be able to use that system until after the full scope of the outbreak has been defined. And IDALS is most likely going to be using USDA's EMERS program for permitting. And there are 6 pieces of information that are essential to pretty much every permit, and this is information that a producer is going to have when they need to have when they request a permit. So permit class is how the movement relates to a control area, why the movement needs to occur, the origin premises, and like we said earlier, you need to have a PIN to be able to receive a permit, destination premise information, what is going to be transported, and then the duration or span of the permit. So again, another really, really important point that if you don't get anything else out of it, you need to understand this, that it is critical to find all livestock premises within a control area as soon as possible. And having a premise identification registration is how we do this. To facilitate this, we would really, really prefer producers to have their premises registered prior to an outbreak. If they don't have it, they will be issued one if they become positive with foot and mouth. And Iowa is currently going through a program of sending out letters to every known premises in 10 counties every month to have this premise database updated. So if producers get a letter from Iowa Department of Agriculture, it is really important that they make sure all the information is correct and send that back to the Department of Agriculture. And that is all I have, if anybody has any questions for me.
So a movement out of that control zone, that would even include market animals or animals for slaughter, anything along those lines, right? That's just any movement at all.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Al, do you have a question?
Yeah, you have a recommendation from Matthew in Asia of like a market-ready medical site or the want to be able to work animals. Do you have a recommendation of how that should be done? Disposal on one site.
So euthanasia always needs to be done in accordance with the AVMA guidelines on euthanasia. And for hogs, that can be captive bolt or CO2 or other gas euthanasia methods. And like Dr. Roth mentioned, if it's a really large premises, the USDA might advise us to take a different direction on the premise, maybe not stamping out, but captive bolt and CO2 gas are, I think, the two preferred methods for swine at this time. For disposal, like we said, to prevent spread of the virus, we want to keep everything on the farm, and that would be either composting or burial. And those are both very large tasks to undertake. But that's why we need producers to have resources identified prior to an outbreak.
Shutting down ventilation.
Ventilation shutdown is a decision that would be made between USDA and the state. It has been discussed with poultry, but it's part of a decision tree where if certain other criteria can't be met, then ventilation shutdown is considered, but you have to prove that you cannot possibly meet the other criteria first. It is absolutely not a first line method of mass depopulation.
Dr. LaBounty, on your website, do you have guidelines for kind of doing emergency composting or burial, just for people to review, to think through how that process might work?
We had some guidelines created in conjunction with Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and those refer specifically to poultry, but the principles are still the same. And so those are either on Iowa Department of Ag or Iowa DNR